We have Alexander Zayats on the left, head of the board of the Institution of Religious Freedom in Ukraine. Right next to him is Igor Bandura, vice president of All Ukrainian Union of Association of Evangelical Christians and Baptists from Ukraine as well. And right next to me is Krzysztof Veres from the Center for Immigration Studies from Washington, D.C. He is an expert on US and European Union immigration and refugee issues. We are going to have that aspect of the story as well. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said earlier in June that over 112 churches were destroyed across the country, and more than 200 heritage sites as well. Among them, there were ancient churches that survived the Second World War. However, they didn't withstand the brutal invasion of Russia. Pentecost celebrations were also interrupted. The devastation is huge, as we can see on the pictures. I think the pictures speak for themselves. Russia denies the civil and infrastructure damages and also the damages. There is no question about it, however, if we see all these pictures. In the fourth month of the invasion, the role of religion has increased as humanitarian need is skyrocketing. However, communities can be mobilized very much so through religious communities and churches. Targeting historic monuments and churches is a crime and a war crime under the framework of international law. Here, our expert, I'm really trying to speak in this one, Alexander has already discovered and investigated and gathered some details and data on the infringements and violations during Crimea. Now my question would be to Alexander that how can the communities, the churches and the groups help the work of different international organizations to reveal all the destruction that happened throughout Ukraine?
Добрий день.
Good afternoon.
Я дуже радий бути разом з вами на цьому заході.
I'm very glad to be here and share with you.
Наш інститут з початку війни збирає інформацію про злочини, які скоює Російська Федерація.
Since the beginning of the war, our Institute of Religious Freedom has started to get together all the information about Russia crime acts in Ukraine.
Раніше ми робили моніторинг і доповідь щодо ситуації в Донецьку, Луганську і Криму.
Before that, we published a report on the situation in Lugansk and Donetsk areas and Crimea.
Але війна, яка прийшла у лютому цього року, вона змінила наші плани, і ми зараз займаємося питаннями цього моніторингу і доповіді, яка буде готова у липні цього року.
But after the war started in February, we had to change our plans, and now we are working on collecting the data, statistics, and information about what is going on now, and we are preparing these materials to be published in July.
Щонайменше 240 культових споруд постраждали від російського вторгнення в Україну.
At least 240 religious buildings has been damaged by Russians.
Найбільше храмів постраждало в Донецькій області 63.
The most buildings that were ruined are in Donetsk region, and there are 63 of them.
На другому місці за кількістю руйнувань культових споруд Київська область.
Then we can talk on the second place is Kyiv region.
В Харківській і Луганській області це 37 і 34.
In Kharkiv and Lugansk regions is 37 and 34 religious buildings destroyed.
Крім обстрілів і руйнувань храмів,
beside the shooting and demolition of church buildings,
відбувається захоплення представників релігійних конфесій російськими окупантами.
Russian occupants started kidnapped church ministers.
Alexander, yes, coming back to that point, I guess it's very important. There has been precedents before in Crimea as well, and Luhansk and Donbass, about abduction of religious personnel. How can you trace them, or is it possible to trace them or contact them? What can you do?
Ну, моніторинг здійснювався різними способами.
We had been monitoring the situation in many different ways.
Це інформація, яку ми отримували з засобів масової інформації, з соцмереж.
We have been working with the open sources like mass media and social networks.
А також опитування конкретних осіб.
But also we talked with individuals.
Да. Якщо говорити про ситуацію, повертаючись назад щодо Криму, Донецьку і Луганську,
If we go back and speak about the situation in Crimea and Lugansk and Donetsk parts,
то дуже важливо, щоб постійно був голос міжнародної спільноти щодо віруючих різних конфесій.
we felt that it was very important that international community would speak on behalf of those who suffered in their territories.
Дуже важливо не чекати, коли будуть вбивати людей.
It was important for us not to wait when people would be killed.
Як це було в 2014 році в Слов'янську, Донецькій області.
It was in 2014 in the city of Slovyansk, of Donetsk region, for example.
А постійно піднімати голос на різних майданчиках.
But to speak about this problem constantly on different stages
І тиснути.
and make pressure.
Але зараз ми маємо зовсім іншу ситуацію. Ми маємо велику війну.
But today the situation is completely different because we are talking about the big war.
І до тих проблем, які були в Донецьку, Луганську, Криму, додалися проблеми на півдні України і в інших місцях, які окуповані.
And to the problems we had in Crimea and occupied parts of Donetsk and Lugansk regions, we have now problems almost in many parts of Ukraine.
І дуже важливо, щоб такий був акцентований голос міжнародної спільноти з приводу цього.
And for us it is important to hear the united voice of international community on these problems.
І по відношенню до російської влади.
In relation to Russia government.
І також по відношенню до російських релігійних діячів.
And also in relation to religious leaders in Russia.
Які пропагували руський мір, ідеологію, яка стала однією з підстав цієї війни.
Those who propagated the so-called Russian world ideology that became a foundation for the war that started.
Які благословили цю війну.
Because many of them has really blessed this war.
І українські релігійні діячі не один раз зверталися до російських релігійних діячів.
And Ukrainian religious leaders constantly tried to talk with religious leaders in Russia,
щоб підняти голос і говорити про мир.
asking them to speak loudly and speak about peace
І зупинити цю війну.
and stop the war.
Зверталися також з приводу того, щоб обміняти полонених.
We have been dealing with the problem of captive soldiers exchange.
Але, на жаль, з боку російських релігійних лідерів не було відповідної реакції.
But unfortunately, we didn't get any response from religious leaders in Russia.
Ми фіксуємо разом із правозахисниками злочини, які вчиняються російськими окупантами в релігійній сфері на території України.
We keep records of all of the criminal acts done by Russian military people in Ukraine.
Я думаю, що подібну фіксацію роблять також в інших сферах, які стосуються злочинів інших організацій.
And I'm sure other organizations are doing a very similar work and collecting the information.
І важливо, щоб за ці злочини в подальшому обов'язково була відповідальність. Можливо, на рівні спеціального трибуналу, який був створений міжнародною спільнотою.
And it is important that all these crimes would get a response maybe from international criminal courts that can be created for these cases particularly.
I guess it's very important to emphasize on the fact that, for example, there are monasteries, for example, the All Saints Monastery of the Sviatogorsk Lavra, which belongs to, and it is under the protection of the Moscow Patriarchate. So that shows us the seriousness and the importance what they are doing, because that belongs to Moscow, and they were protecting and supporting Putin as well. So my question would be to Alex, that all those talks with Moscow and with the churches, leaders of the churches in Russia, did those lead somewhere? Because we can see that all these troops and soldiers, nothing is sacred for them. They even attack those churches that belongs to the Moscow Patriarchate. Can you see some sympathy, or can you do something with that?
Ну, в принципі, в своєму питанні ви відповіли на це запитання.
There is an answer in your question, in fact.
I was afraid of that.
Якраз цього й боялися.
Да, тобто, якщо ми говоримо про кількість пошкоджених, зруйнованих храмів, то перше місце серед конфесій належить Українській православній церкві в єдності з Московським патріархатом.
If we are talking about the numbers of church buildings destroyed by Russian army, the number one is church buildings that belong to Ukrainian Orthodox Church in the unity with Moscow Patriarchate.
Це 100 культових споруд.
100
На даний момент.
100 buildings.
Друге місце – це християни-п'ятидесятники, 42 споруди.
Second place would be Pentecostal churches, 42 buildings.
Християни-баптисти,
Then Baptist churches,
37,
37.
і далі інші.
And then smaller numbers of
Якщо ми
other
говоримо про
denominations.
руйнування храмів, то ми бачимо, що для російських солдат їм байдуже кого обстрілювати, що руйнувати, чи то протестанти, чи то Українська православна церква, яка в єдності з Московським патріархатом.
From what we have observed, for Russian soldiers, doesn't matter what to destroy and what these buildings, what denomination this building belong to, Ukrainian Church or the Church of Moscow Patriarchate.
Вони мають негативне ставлення до всього українського.
They have negative attitude to everything that belong to Ukrainians.
Ми бачили ситуацію, яка була в Бучі, Ірпіні.
We have observed the situation and tragedy that happened in Bucha, Irpin.
Пастор Ігор з міста Ірпіня.
Pastor Igor is from Irpin.
Тобто там все просто руйнували.
They just tried to destroy literally everything.
І це чудо, що деякі культові споруди, вони залишилися вцілілими в цих
And
місцях.
the fact that in these places some of church buildings remain untouched is the miracle from God.
В деяких з цих культових споруд в укриттях, підвалах ховалися люди під
In
час
many of such
окупації цих міст.
church buildings, people founded a bomb shelter when they were under shooting.
Ну, і я, здається, говорив про це, що велика кількість культових будівель, яка пошкоджена в УПЦ НП, пов'язана з тим, що саме на півдні і на сході, де відбуваються військові дії, там знаходиться переважна більшість їх громад і культових споруд.
And I mentioned already, but it is interesting fact that why the most church buildings that have been ruined or damaged belongs to the Moscow Patriarchate churches is that all these churches is located in mostly Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine. And it is strange because Russia pretend to come and protect their own Russian-speaking people. But in the end, these people suffer the most.
І на завершення, можливо, це ще пов'язано з тим, якщо ми говоримо про храми УПЦ НП, що російські війська, які вторглися в Україну, вони не побачили, що їх зустрічають з квітами. Можливо, вони
Maybe,
надіялися на це.
another reason that Russian soldiers expected that people would meet them with bread and flowers, and when they realized no one was expecting them, they were angry and started to destroy everything on their way, including church buildings.
Натомість вони відчули опір всього українського народу,
They experienced the resistance from Ukrainian
який
people,
сражається за свою незалежність.
because Ukrainians were fighting and are fighting for their freedom and independence.
My next question would be for both of you actually. What are the most difficult issue that you're facing? I mean, we can, I guess, talk about two phases: during shelling and after technically everything is destroyed. And I'm talking about religious communities and in general, how can you support people? What can you do?
The most difficult for Ukrainians was the fact that Russian President Putin, believed that there is no such a nation as Ukrainians, and he was convinced that there should not be such a country as Ukraine. And from his pseudo-historical lessons he shared on the media, we all realized that for him this war is existential, because he couldn't imagine new Russian identity without Ukraine being a part of his new empire. For us, it was existential threat, because it meant that for us as Christians, there would not be any place in this new world that Putin would like to build. So we would be either destroyed and killed, or we would have to leave the country and save our own life and our families. So we realized that he would not tolerate anything that is not fit to his picture of the world. And that was not the recognition only by religious community with our concern about freedom, and especially religious freedom. That was understanding and feeling of almost all the Ukrainians. So this is why, despite all the costs we pay, and the huge sacrifice Ukrainians are paying every day, people are united, and they are willing to stand to the end. For us, the end means our victory, because if Ukraine would not win in this battle, Ukraine would disappear. And for us, this is existential threat, this is existential battle, and this is probably the most important battle in our recent history, because it is about our existence, our life, our freedom, our future.
Technically everything. The other day we had a discussion, and you mentioned that, for example, Irpin, all the buildings were damaged, 70% of the buildings were damaged, and 100% or close to 100% of the infrastructure is damaged. Now, when they left, you also mentioned, when the area was technically emptied or left behind by the Russians, it was very difficult, and the church had a huge role to organize food, water, and basic supplies for the people, which is a huge challenge, I guess.
You know, the way Russia is fighting is barbarian in its essence. If they cannot take the territory, if they cannot win the battle, they just try to destroy everything on their way, including people, buildings, infrastructure, everything. So it's just a simple question. If you come to save people, if you come to rescue people, if you come just to get this territory, why you destroy everything? Even if you would win, what you would do tomorrow with the territories that you destroyed everything? So in our city, which was taken very quickly and unexpectedly, I've never thought that I could imagine that Russian army is coming right to Dnieper and they would not be able to cross the Dnieper, but Belarus gave them the place and they come from the north and they did what no one expected. The first day of the war, they were under near Kiev and Irpin, our city, was taken. So many people left, but still many stayed. And the tragedy was that not only buildings and infrastructure was ruined, but more than 1,300 innocent civilians were tortured and killed, and their bodies were on the streets for almost a month. Some of them were buried in the people's backyards. And people were afraid, and those who remained, they stayed. For example, in our church basement, there were hundreds of people staying there, and church provided what they had: just water, hot meal, or at least once a day. Can you imagine what can you do if everything is destroyed? I remember when Irpin was rescued, and we delivered first 2 trucks with food boxes. And when we gave these food boxes to people standing in line, hundreds of people, we realized the simple fact, what they would do with this food in the boxes, how they would prepare a meal, no water, no electricity, no gas. So people just started open fire at their places, and several families came together to prepare the meal. That was the only way. So the church quickly bought a big generator, and we dig the well just to pump water, and we use that generator. People can come and plug in their cell phones just to stay in touch with their relatives. So we started to cook for people, and then when people started to come back, everything was damaged. So volunteers from the church organized several like reconstruction team. It's not really to reconstruct, but maybe small repairments to close windows, because all the windows were destroyed, and it was still quite cold, because if you remember, in our part of the Ukraine, the spring was very cold. And I remember the first time I slept in my home with broken windows, just closed with plastics. I remember I took 2 coats and all my clothes, and I had a hat on my head. That was first time I slept with a hat on my head because it was so cold. And this is what people experience. So church members have done great work to provide basic things. Then it became easier because the city was clean from all the military, from mines. And then electricity was slowly restored, water came, so life was coming back. But first 2-3 weeks, it was completely mess. And even if a humanitarian organization can bring something, people still couldn't prepare a meal. So now we have projects like, okay, to prepare a hot meal. It's like mobile kitchen, to provide money for repairment teams, to help people that the apartments or buildings were damaged. It is other programs to provide people with basic means to live. So it is not only for internally displaced people of refugees to provide them with basic needs, but it is also when the territories are rescued and Ukrainian army rescues the territories. It's just disaster in that areas. And this is where the help, humanitarian help is needed. but not only just, as I said, to deliver things, but to think how people can prepare, how people can take care for themselves, how people can get courage to live there and to rebuild their life. Because the most important, personally, what I experienced was that I lost the feeling of my home. My home was not destroyed, it was just damaged. 6 windows, the roof. But you see, when I went for a couple of days to clean things and make some repairments, and then I was on the way back to Lviv, where our temporary office was. And for a couple of hours I was struggling in myself because I lost the feeling of my home. I was moving from my home to my temporal place, but in fact I had this feeling I'm lost. Because that home was not my home, and the one I was going to was not also my home. So it's not only about the destruction of buildings or infrastructure. There's something more terrible. This destroyed people's life, people's soul. People lost this feeling because it's not only about the building you live in. It's about all the people you build connections every day. It is your work. It is places you go to work for major. It is your church. It is everyday life that we call our home, our life, and this is what the war destroys. And it will take sometimes to rebuild buildings, but it will take even more times to rebuild souls, to rebuild people's life. And this is what future holds for us.
Standing here, yes, it's really hard to imagine what you are going through and all the people in Ukraine are going through. However, there are lots of people, millions of people. We are talking about millions of people who were, I don't think this is the right word to use, but were not that lucky. They really lost their home, or they decided to flee the country, looking for safety, looking for temporary home or temporary safety. And Christoph is going to update us about the situation and really the unprecedented and unceasing cooperation between the society, the civil society, and church organizations across the border or the neighboring countries. Christoph, could you please update us?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk about those Ukrainians who are forced to cross international borders because of President Putin's barbaric and illegal invasion of the country, and are forced to seek refuge abroad. With the rest spread out of the other countries of the European Union. The refugees arriving from Ukraine are mostly women and children, since military-aged men are supposed to stay in Ukraine and fight against the invading Russian force. There are recent trends in the refugee movement around Europe. At the beginning of the refugee crisis, we had hundreds of thousands of people coming every week, but after Putin realized that, okay, I guess it's not going to work. So after Putin realized that he won't be able to take Kiev, and the fighting was mostly contained to the eastern part of Ukraine. The number of refugees arriving to Europe started to slow down, and according to Frontex, which is the border guard agency of the European Union, during the last week of May and the first week of June, there were more people crossing back into Ukraine than leaving the country. Just a few thoughts about the European response. The European Union triggered the Temporary Protection Directive on the 4th of March, which gives temporary protection to Ukrainian citizens and legal residents inside the EU, meaning that they have residence permit, access to employment, housing, social welfare, medical treatment, education for minors, without having to go through a lengthy asylum process. They just have to register. And now I'm going to move on to Hungary, specifically Hungary, because in Hungary the response to the refugee crisis gave a huge role to the NGOs, and specifically religious NGOs or NGOs with religious affiliation. The cornerstone of the Hungarian government's response to the crisis was to distribute a large amount of funds among NGOs and coordinate the activity of NGOs in order to avoid superfluous activities and to maximize the efficacy of their resources. The efforts of the NGOs are coordinated by the so-called Hungarian Charity Council. The big NGOs that belong to the Charity Council are the Catholic Charity, the Maltese Aid, the Hungarian Interchurch Aid, the Hungarian Reformed Church Aid, the Hungarian Red Cross, and the Baptist Aid. So as you could hear, it's only the Hungarian Red Cross which is not a church-affiliated NGO. Usually when we look at headlines and what we see on the news, usually we just see the immediate aid that refugees are given when they arrive at the European Union, aid workers handing out food, medical supplies, basic hygiene needs at the border. But there are also many other things. This is just an initial step when the refugees arrive to Europe. There are many other things that has to be addressed. For example, the Hungarian Interchurch Service, just 3 days after the war started, set up a help point on the Ukrainian side of the Ukrainian-Hungarian border, because at the beginning of the conflict, so many people were fleeing the country that on the Ukrainian side, usually you had people waiting for 8, 10, 12 hours without help, without aid, because most of the NGOs were handing out aid on the Hungarian side after they already crossed the border. When people receive immediate humanitarian aid, in Hungary we had almost 800,000 people crossing into Hungary from Ukraine, but most of them continued their journey towards other European countries. In this regard, Hungary played a kind of transit country in the refugee crisis, with around 12-10% of the people crossing in from Ukraine staying in the country. But what happens to those people who stay in Hungary? Well, first of all, if they decide to stay, then they have to be integrated. The Catholic Caritas and the Hungarian Interchurch Service, both of them set up integration center for Ukrainians in Budapest, finding them temporary and then permanent accommodation, finding them work, and helping their children to integrate into the Hungarian education system. The Catholic Caritas received financial and professional support from the American Catholic Relief Service, while the Hungarian Interchurch Service received a donation of $1.5 million from the Taipei representative office in Budapest. The Hungarian Interchurch Service is also doing outreach work in Ukraine. Already on the 2nd of March, the Hungarian Interchurch Service set up a center in Lviv, which is the biggest Ukrainian city in the western part of the country. And the deputy mayor of the city told the media that when it comes to international aid organizations, it was the Hungarian Interchurch Service that first arrived in Lviv and the first organization that he negotiated with. Since then, the Hungarian Interchurch Service set up other offices and operations in Ukraine, also in the central and the eastern part of the country. In Kiev, they opened the center with collaboration of the Finn Church Aid and the ACT Alliance.
Thank you so much, Christoph. There is another aspect of the war that I would like to emphasize, and that would be a question for all of you. Then after that, I would like to open up the place for Q&A, so if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. The other aspect is on both sides of the border, actually. War is brutal. Losing our homes and safety is unimaginable for us. But there is the other aspect we really need to pay attention to, and that is human trafficking on one side, and on the other side is taking advantage on vulnerable people, women and children on both sides of the border. We're talking about soldiers and also refugees who are being escorted through the border, over the border, and abducted or fall victim for human trafficking. I guess leaders of all faiths, the role of the leaders of all faiths are crucial from that aspect. What can you do? How can you tackle that issue? How can you prevent it on both sides of the border? Probably we should start with Igor and Alex.
I can mention only the problem of deportation of Ukrainians to Russia. Russians call this like immigration, but immigration is what people choose under the pressure of the situation. But if they cannot choose, if they are forced to go only one way, and this only one way is way to Russia, it is called deportation. It's forceful moving people. And what, if I remember correctly, almost 800,000 Ukrainian children were deported to Russia. Among them are many orphans from state orphanages. And these children are prepared to be adopted by Russian families. So no one was asking these people if they would like to go there or not. Some have been happy to leave Russia through other borders and come back to Ukraine either through Baltic states or then through European Union countries. But most are still in Russia, and most of them would be sent or already sent to Far East Russia, to the most remote places, and they are taking passports, they are taking their cell phones, so they do not have any connection with their relatives or with friends. And the life of these people is very unclear, and the destiny of these people are unclear. And we believe this is a terrible crime, and we should speak about this. So I do not know about the situation on the other side of the border with European countries. Maybe you can tell more about this.
Yes, human trafficking and sexual exploitation. This is also something that usually doesn't make the headlines. In Hungary, it's the Baptist Aid who launched a specific program in order to tackle these issues. What usually happens is that all these refugees that are coming into the country, they are already obviously a vulnerable group, and young women, young girls, they can be easily exploited because they are in a vulnerable situation, and if someone offers to provide them shelter, provide them food and protection, then they can find themselves in a situation where they can be sexually exploited. It's a huge problem, yes, and I also saw it on social media once or twice because my family also hosted Ukrainian refugees, and in all these Facebook groups where people were offering free accommodation for refugees, there were a few that said, yeah, I would like to host Ukrainian refugees, but I only accept young single women. So the Baptist Aid is working with close cooperation with the police. The Hungarian police, they are monitoring all these Facebook groups, and they are trying really hard to root out these problems and protect all these vulnerable groups.
Because the church's role in that case and technically every aspect of the war is unquestionable. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Yeah, question for the pastor. The Russian soldier, the average Russian soldier, the average Russian soldier, do you believe that they believe in the war, that they're in favor of fighting in Ukraine, or are they, what do you think the attitude of the average Russian soldier is?
I cannot judge what is inside of everybody, but the way that Russian soldiers treated Ukrainians in every single place they took is horrible. It is not only Putin who is trying to kill Ukraine. Putin does not kill personally no one. He made a decision to start this war. He sent his army. But it is ordinary soldiers who come, who kill innocent, who torture people, who rape women, teenage girls, who steal everything. They took toilets from Ukrainians' home because they were amazed that Ukrainians have toilets inside of their buildings. They took washing machines and they brought everything back to Russia. They took toys to send to their children. I beg your pardon, they took women's underwear as a gift to their own wives. It's just unbelievable. But this is real facts, unfortunately. So this is why we are talking about barbarians coming to Ukraine. They are not soldiers. They are barbarians and they are wild animals. Because people cannot do things like that. Because even during the war, there is a law of the war. There are certain way to fight. But what they do is not fighting. They are killers. And they enjoy killing people. Again, I don't want to generalize or put everything at one pot. But from what we have seen, we were shocked. Unfortunately, this is true. Some Russian journalists say, oh, you understand, there are very few soldiers from Moscow or from St. Petersburg. These people don't go to fight. There are people from Burat or other remote places in Russia, and for them this is the only way to get money and so on and so on. But still, even if you are there for economical reason, you are in poor parts of Russia and you would like to make money, why you kill innocent people? Why you torture people? It is unbelievable. And as Alexander said, all these cases are documented. There are eyewitnesses, and our intelligence service get information about everybody. So we know now who was where, commanders, their names, we know everything. And we hope there would be a time when everybody would be responsible for the cruelty they did for Ukrainian innocent people.
Please, let's not forget that previously we could have seen the pictures of the destruction in churches. And we should definitely keep it in mind that targeting non-military objects itself constitutes war crime. And there are plenty of documentation of that one as well. Any other question?
But don't worry about it, I can speak loud enough for that. I can shout.
Okay.
As a Hungarian, I have experienced on several occasions the effects of the war in the media that would try to depict the Hungarian approach or the Ukrainian approach against each other as something very negative. And my question would be first oriented to the Hungarian lecture, but also to the Ukrainian one as well. How do you think the Ukrainian-Hungarian relations managed to develop in the last month? And how do you think they can still improve in the future? Because at this point I say that the relations are improving, but how else can we improve the relations?
Well, first of all, the Hungarian government condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and if I'm not mistaken, the Hungarian Prime Minister recently had a very constructive phone call with the Ukrainian President, President Zelensky, and after that Zelensky tweeted that it was a very constructive phone call, and he also invited the Hungarian Prime Minister to visit Kiev. So yes, you can say that relations has been improving in the past months, I guess.
Please allow me to add that the support the civilians in Hungary and all neighboring countries are providing for the refugees is truly unprecedented. So when we're talking about relations between the two countries, in that perspective, it's unquestionable. Nobody said that they should not come, or it was never an experience that they are not welcomed. Or people in every single country where refugees went, they were welcomed with food. They never had to spend one single day in shelters. They were all welcomed at family homes. They were welcomed in people's own home with their own children. And I don't think that requires more explanation. And I guess that's all that matters at this point. And we should leave the rest for politicians, probably. Any other question?
I think this is sort of relevant to what you're talking about. Is there a possibility that Putin will gradually reimpose communism, that he will somehow find a way? Because he's said that, Putin has said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst disaster. So, and his patron is now China. So, is that possibly in the works in the next few years or so? I mean, he has great power.
Yes, it is possible if Ukraine will not stop him in Ukraine. So this is why we are fighting, and this is why we ask all international community to stay with us and to help us in all possible means. Because if not, he would get more power, and what he would do, it is even difficult to imagine. But I just would give you one fact. I mentioned this yesterday. The first thing that Russians do when they come and occupy a city or a village, they bring back old street names with leaders of communistic times. Because in Ukraine there was a law of decommunization. So we read out all the communistic ideology from streets, from symbols, from whatever. So they bring these names back. They bring back Lenin statues. So I think it is not by chance. I think it is intentional. And you are completely right. If they would win, they would like to rebuild the former Soviet Union, or like we call Soviet Union 2.0. And that would be a huge tragedy, not only for Ukraine, but for all the neighboring countries. This is why, as Ukrainians, we understand clearly what he would like to do, and this is why we are fighting. Our neighbors, like Baltic states, Poland, Hungary, Romania, people don't have questions because we have been in the Soviet Union or under the influence of the Soviet Union. No one would like to go back to that past. But this is what he would like to do. He would like to bring everybody back to the past. And yes, this is why we would like to stop him, and we should stop him together.
Я не все зрозумів, я виходив, але я хочу сказати кілька слів.
I would like to add some words.
Те, що зараз відбувається в Україні, це виклик для всього світу.
The situation in Ukraine is a challenge to the entire world.
Для кожного політика, для кожного релігійного діяча, для кожної простої людини.
For every politician, for every religious leader, for every ordinary man and woman.
Ми всі разом маємо відповісти, на яких принципах буде існувати майбутній мир.
We should unite all together and give a clear answer what future we would like to build together.
Чи це буде принцип сили права,
It would be the principle, the rule of power,
чи принцип права сили?
or
Сила права або право сили. І тому ми дуже дякуємо за підтримку, яка була надана і надається Україні.
we are grateful for the support that Ukraine is getting.
Ми дуже дякуємо країнам, які допомогли знайти там приют для українських біженців.
We are grateful to all the countries that hosted Ukrainian refugees.
Що стосується Угорщини, я знаю, що одна з єврейських громад, вона переїхала майже в повному складі, крім чоловіків,
For example,
і зараз знаходиться в Будапешті.
when we are talking about Hungary, I know the entire Jewish communities that left Ukraine and moved to Hungary, and they are living together there. Budapest.
Але ми потребуємо подальшої політичної,
But we need more political,
економічної,
economical,
гуманітарної
humanitarian,
і військової підтримки.
and military support.
Тому що це питання, яке зараз відбувається в Україні, це стосується всього демократичного світу, кожної країни.
Because what is happening in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine, it relates to the entire democratic world.
Тому ми просимо вас не мовчати, а подавати свій голос.
This is why we ask you and urge you not to keep silent, but to speak loudly about your opinion on Ukraine.
Голос кожного має важливе значення.
Voice of every single person is important.
Дякую.
It was a nice closure. However, I would like to add that please keep your support toward Ukraine, especially that the winter is coming, and if you follow the news, you know that energy security is a huge issue in the EU and across Europe. And before the war, Ukraine was importing 80% of its fuel from abroad. At the moment, the sea lines, the ways are all blocked. So it's not possible. Ukraine is facing huge issues with fuel. There is shortages, and by the way, there are some countries in the EU as well who are experiencing the same. Gas is going to be, I assume, also an issue, and winters are traditionally difficult and cold. And as I mentioned, and yesterday Igor told me, and I told you as well, that in Irpin, for example, 70% of the buildings and 100% of the infrastructure is damaged. Now please imagine yourself in that situation where fuel is scarce, gas is scarce, you have no windows, as Igor mentioned how he was sleeping in February or early March. There's nothing to heat with. Just put yourself in that situation. What would you do? And upon all that, Europe is struggling as well. They are struggling with energy, they are struggling with fuel. And at the moment, the support toward refugees are solid. And Europe is welcoming everybody with the warmest heart. But can we imagine what is going to happen when all that source is going to be shut down and there's no way to replace it? And people are going to need to leave Ukraine. And Europe would love to help. The question is how. So I guess global support, humanitarian and economical, is most needed, and definitely before the winter or for the winter. So please keep all that in your mind.